Welcome to Lesson 3 in Colgate VisLab's Lessons in Autodesk Maya, this time focusing around UV mapping and texturing. During the lesson, we'll cover what exactly UV maps are, how to UV map an object, how to arrange your UV maps for texturing, and how to texture an object. Let's get started. So, I believe anyone who's run the previous lessons ought to recognize this building. We built it in our modeling chapter of the lessons, and I figured we should get started texturing it. So if we want to texture this building, the first thing we have to do is look at UV maps. Now, what exactly are UV maps? Well, a UV map is a two-dimensional representation of a 3D object's space for texturing. Think of it as the Earth if you peeled it like an orange and laid it out flat. It's that sort of map, just for a more complex object than a sphere. So, when you begin with, for example, a polygon primitive like a cube, every object, even a primitive, has a UV map. You can see a UV map by going to UV and UV editor. This will pull up a window that looks like this. Plenty of tools up top, which we'll get to later. But most importantly, we have this central gray square here on the top right. And you can see that the cube itself has been folded out here. Now, if we were just texturing this cube, we would be able to leave this map here, this map of vertices, otherwise known as UVs in this sense. We'd be able to leave it like this and add an image to this folded out shape. If we did that, we would see that represented on this object here. UVs, by the way, are simply vertices of an object represented on the 2D plane here, such that you can texture them. However, when moving to more complex objects, like our house here, you can see that the object itself is a lot more complicated. And if you were to attempt to texture this, you would get an odd amount of smearing and random sizing issues and just a whole mess that you wouldn't be able to visualize properly. For example, there. That's the look you'd get if you tried to texture an object without messing with UVs. Not exactly appealing. It looks more like a camo jacket than a stone wall. So that's the reason we UV map objects. So how do we go about doing that? Well, the first step is to take individual maps of your object. We do this by highlighting certain sections of faces on the object, as you can see here. I'm going to begin with the object's roof. Alright, so I've got this roof selected, and you can see that in fact it shows up in the UV map. However, it's still part of the overall folded square, so we're going to separate it. We do that by going under UV again and hitting any one of these three maps here. We have a cylindrical map, a planar map, and a spherical map. The maps in question are sort of templates for mapping objects. The cylindrical map, as you can imagine, is used for tubes, pipes, and other things that would benefit from an easy unwrap in a spherical way, a cylindrical way. The spherical map is the same for objects that are orb-shaped in general. And the planar map, which we're going to focus on, is good for walls, roofs, and other architectural-based objects. So we're going to use planar map and go to the option box. And you have a few options here in any of the mapping options. You have you can fit the projection to a certain type of plane, or you can project from an axis. Now what that means is that you can either have Maya select the best plane based on what it judges through an algorithm. You can select the bounding box of the entire object and have it project from there. Or you can select a specific axis if you know that your object or the section of your object is on a specific axis. Additionally, you can use the camera that you're currently occupying, in my case the perspective camera, to take a map from that. Now, in this case, I'm going to use the y-axis because this roof is flat to the vertical axis. When I hit apply, you can see that we've created a new UV map. And you can, in fact, edit and arrange these with the same tools that you use to manipulate the main screen in Maya. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to arrange these in the UV mapper. Now why am I doing this? I'll talk to you a little bit about that while I take out the rest of the UV maps here. Well, the reason that we arrange maps is because if we are adding multiple materials to an object, especially if we are going to hand paint the texture for that object, we need to emphasize both arrangement and size in our UV maps, all within this gray square here. I'll show you what that looks like in a sec. Now, for this next section, it's going to be, I'm going to use both walls on a single axis. And in this case, I will reference my axes here and choose the z-axis and just hit apply. And you can see that there is a sort of snapshot of just this axis. Now you notice it might be a little bit off proportionally, so I will scale it to match that. And just leave that by the wayside there. Now, if I had the time, I'd go back through and modify all of these just to show you, the full mapping process, although that might be a little bit boring. So, when you're finished with a full mapping process, which entails taking snapshots of every aspect of your object and arranging them in the square, you will end up with something like this. Now this is a full arrangement of UVs. Every aspect of our little house here is arranged on the map in a flat way. And therefore it's completely ready for texturing. So, from here, we are going to learn about how to texture an object. Okay, so now that we have our object fully UV mapped, we are going to texture that object. Now, how is this accomplished? Well, our first step is to add materials. When every object is created, specifically polygon primitives, or just polygons in general in Maya, it's assigned a default shader known as a Lambert. A Lambert, which we'll get into in a moment, is a shader that doesn't have a lot of reflectivity. It's the base shader for Maya, etc. However, because it's assigned this base shader, we don't want to modify that material, because that would cause modifications on every object we'd create in Maya for the rest of our file. We don't want that. So what we want to do, and what I'll do here, is assign a new material by selecting these faces. Holding down right click and scrolling down to assign new material. When you do that, you'll get a window that pops up that has a whole host of different materials here. Now, this can be a bit daunting, but I'd prefer that we just focus on Lambert, Phong, and Blinn. This is because these are the three shaders that you will use most often when working in Autodesk Maya at the VisLab. Now, I've mentioned Lamberts before, and as I said, those are shaders that don't have a lot of reflectivity or a lot of specular highlights to them or anything like that. They are a very flat shader. They're what you'd call a matte by default. They are used primarily for things like wood or stone that's not been polished, or perhaps a fabric or something like that. Something that isn't going to reflect light in a visible or, distinct way. Now, Fongs, on the other hand, are the other extreme to that. They are very bright, very glossy, very shiny. They are used for plastics, for highly polished stones and precious metals. They are used for things that have a very refined sheen to them. Or, on the other hand, they're also used often for wet objects or objects that are liquids on occasion. And glass. Fongs make very good glass. So, the middle ground to that is the Blinn, which has more of a diffused highlight to it. You use these for like brushed metal, for polished wood, maybe, for painted metal or paint itself, depending on whether it's dry or not. So, as I said, we're going to select the Lambert because we are going to do this roof in sort of a... let me show you. It'd be easier just to show you this little collection of what we call textures that I've acquired. Okay, here's the selection of textures that I've acquired to work with this building. If we open them up in the viewer here, you can see we have a sort of stacked stone, which I'll be using for the walls. We have a painted wood sort of thing that I don't think I'll make use of, but is interesting nonetheless. A sort of inlaid stone that I'm going to use for the small floors. Oh, a parking lot, which I may use later on in our process. A sort of shale stone for a roof. And another set of tiles for a roof, and this is the one I'll actually be using for our roof. Additionally, I have a sort of thatched roof here. And these are all examples of textures that you'd like to use. They're very straight on, they're nicely realistic in a good resolution, and they are tileable, which is to say you can repeat them over and over again without too much issue visually. So, now that I have these, I have our object highlighted, I assigned a new material, a Lambert. Now you can see here that by default it just calls itself Lambert 2. Well, as we know with Autodesk Maya, we need to name things in order to organize them. Textures are no exception, so we are going to call this roof tile, using the same namespace that we're used to, Lambert. So now we know what it's meant for and what sort of material it is without having to check in the excess attributes when we're going through a huge collection of materials. So, with roof tile Lambert, we need to add our picture texture to that material. To do that, we're going to click the checkbox here, and then you can see that you have a number of options for adding to that color attribute. And then you click File, click the little file, and if you've set your project properly, it will immediately pull up the Source Images folder in your Maya project. This is where you should be adding all of your texture images to. And if you've done both of those things, you'll have a collection of textures here. I'll pick the tile here, the slate, and open it. Now, you can see that this looks a little bit big. This is because we need to arrange the 2D texture a little bit on our object. To do that, we're going to go to the Place 2D Texture and modify the Repeat UV. This is because the scale of our UV, although it is laid out flat, is a little bit small for this image. I'm going to choose to repeat this UV because it is a tileable texture a number of times on our object. And as you can see, for at least part of the object, it works out. Now, additionally, because it is tileable only in one direction, I'm going to need to modify my UV map. If you need to do this at any point during the process, the method is the same as when you produce an initial UV map. I'm going to select a smaller section of my UV map, and you can see it represented here. And I'm going to modify that with another planar map from the y-axis. This will produce a large-scale model, which I'm going to shrink and scale with the same tools that we've used. And I'm also going to use a tool up here called Rotate to rotate that twice 45 degrees. And using Scale, match it to the part of our map that works. This is just a quick and easy modification you can make in order to apply your textures in a uniform way. And as you can see, this segment here, which we modified, right here, works out perfectly when compared to our original. Now we'll do this a couple more times. To the segments that don't quite work out. Using that same method of scaling and rotating. And there you are. Now you can make additional modifications to your object as much as you like. You can tweak this so that it is laid out a little better on your object if you like. But for the most part, this is going to suit us for now. Now, you can in fact add multiple materials to the same object, and in fact I encourage it. So, for example, if we'd like to map this object, we go Assign New Material, and again we'll use a Lambert. Now it's worth noting that every material that you make use of in Maya has a number of common attributes. These are color, which we've made use of already, transparency, which allows us to modify the see-through capability of our object, ambient color, which increases its color when not exposed to light, incandescence, which increases its reactivity to light, bump mapping, which allows us to add a 3D aspect to a 2D texture and give it a little bit of roughness, diffuse, which is the scale to which you see the color versus the light effect on an object, translucence, which is the degree to which light can pass through an object, and translucence depth and focus, which allow you to tweak translucence. Now, as I was saying, I'm going to add another material to the same object. To that we go under File, and I think for the walls I'll pick the groutless brick. Now as you can see, again, this needs some arranging. So we go under Place 2D Texture and repeat the UV a number of times. That looks more like it. Now you can do this repeatedly to an object until you have a fully textured object. As you can see, every texture has been arranged and scaled to suit the general preference of the user and the realistic scaling of said texture. And the result is a fairly realistic looking building. And so that is how you texture an object. Thanks for watching, guys.